Now, I stated in the report that I spoke initially to 15 members and 14 officers, union representatives and internal audit. I've actually now spoken to more than that because I've also spoken to group leaders and some senior representatives of groups. I'm speaking to this committee now. So there will have been very extensive input from across the council. And when the review was initiated, all members of the council were given my contact details, and indeed some members of the council did contact me directly and make comments and observations to me. So that there's been very wide input from across the council, both members with considerable experience and also members who've recently joined the council. And I'd like to thank everybody for their input. I have not interviewed formally or informally any former officers or former members, and that's really because I was not carrying out an investigation. This is governance review, and very often the sort of things that I'm looking at can be found in contemporaneous documents, particularly emails, committee records, committee reports, and so forth. However, when I dealt with Applegarth, I did formally interview officers in particular and some members, because I was asked to look at the allegations there in some detail. And I've therefore covered that later in the report in some detail. Now, training and development, I think, came up as a recurring issue in feedback from the committee and in other arenas. I think member training and development is now a matter which sits, I think, very clearly under the Standards Committee. The terms of reference to the Standards Committee have been refreshed as part of the update of the Constitution, and therefore where members have made observations about the need for training, particularly for new members, particularly around issues around code of conduct, whether use of FOIs is appropriate, for example, I would urge the committee to pick those sorts of issues up in its work programme and as it develops a training programme for the council moving forward. Now, dealing with conduct, paragraph 3.4 of the report is quite important. And paragraph 3.4 identifies alleged styles of conduct. And I think my concern is not really to go into the detail of what may or may not have been said by individual people when. My concern, I think, is the impact of alleged conduct. And the impact of alleged conduct is set out in paragraph 3.4.2, where you have managed to create a culture where, for example, confidence from officers that anything will be investigated properly and lead to any change is actually very, very low. That lack of confidence amongst officers clearly is very unhelpful in terms of trying to build a high-performing organisation committed to good governance. A mindset of working around individuals, how would they react if I did things, also it is not a healthy culture. And members being reserved and cautious when making comments to other members is also not a healthy culture. And I think what concerned me is not just the nature of the allegations that were made, but their impact. And for councils to run effectively, you need to have both officers and members who feel that they can have good, robust, if necessary, from time to time, conversations where members and officers feel that they can talk frankly to each other, where individuals' views and opinions will be respected. Now, whilst I think that was probably the culture in the majority of the council, it clearly was not the culture at the heart of the council. And I think that really is quite worrying in terms of governance. And I think a key learning point here for the council is that if you do not tackle inappropriate conduct and behaviour at the right time, then you can find that it becomes normalised. And when it becomes normalised, then you get the sort of organisational culture that I describe in 3.4.2. One that is closed, one which is fearful, not one that thrives on intellectual challenge and intellectual debate to try and improve the quality of decisions. The issues, I think, around decision-taking generally is that the council got trapped into a situation where I think Roles and responsibilities were not well understood. They certainly do not appear to have been respected. Councils have to take decisions in particular ways. You have to consider all options. You have to demonstrate that you've considered them properly. You have to be careful on issues like hospitality. You are dealing with public funds and public money. And I think given the nature and the nature of the conduct that I referred to earlier, I think it's quite clear that there had become a breakdown of trust and confidence between some officers and some members. And I think that was very damaging to the council. And it's quite clear to me that the new leader, was Councillor Millard, I should say, and together with the new chief executive, have made significant progress in restoring effective decision taking and rebuilding that trust and that confidence. Councillor Evans, I think, particularly referred to the issue of transparency, and I refer to that in my recommendations. I think that is actually a very, very important point. There's a distinction between transparency within the council and transparency outside of the council. And I think those are issues that you as a council need to think through rather more carefully. I think when elected members revert to using FOIs, for example, it suggests that the issues around transparency are perhaps not well developed and thought through as perhaps they could be within the council. And I'd urge, as part of that building the ethical culture, to think those sort of issues through that Councillor Evans referred to. And the reason I frame these recommendations is that I know from experience that when a council gets into a series of bad habits, and they are long-lasting bad habits, you can't just flick a switch and everything is changed the following day. You have to work hard at it, because people lose sight of where a boundary line is drawn. People lose sight of proper process, and it gets eroded at the edges. And all of that erosion at the edges can lead to improper decision taking. So the council needs, I think, to rebuild that ethical culture. And therefore, the first recommendation I make is around rebuilding that ethical culture and considering some kind of value statement for the council. I'm not generally a fan of these sort of things, but I think that they can have their place and their time. And I think this is a time where it would be helpful for the council to actually formally consider some kind of value statement. And by that, I mean something like a declaration that you want to be open, honest and transparent in your dealings. You won't adhere just to the letter, but also the spirit of codes and protocols, that you welcome challenge in a constructive and civil manner, because that helps the council to improve, and that you respect the role that each other play, both officers and opposition backbench and cabinet members. And above all, I think the learning point for the council is that whilst you embrace those sorts of values, you will challenge those who do not. And I think that is the very important point in terms of any type of value statement that the council produces. In terms of conduct, I mean, the overriding advice, I think, is that members should heed the comments I make in the report about standing up and being counted when challenging conduct. Now, by that, I don't mean making loads of tit-for-tat references to the Standards Committee. You know, there are many instances where a quiet word, a bit of coaching and mentoring will resolve the issue quite quickly and quite simply. Where that is not the case, it should be referred to the Standards Committee. Where it's serious and repeated, then it should be also subjected to group discipline. Because under the Localism Act, local standards committees have very limited powers, and therefore the real sanctions that can be implemented in terms of helping to moderate members' conduct and behaviour is through the group. And I would urge members to think that through very, very carefully within their political groups. I make a number of observations around the Council's Code of Conduct and how those fit in with other codes, and I'd urge the Council to think that those issues through. In terms of decision making, I think this is one of the most tricky areas. The Council needs to be clear how and when it takes decisions, the right and proper process to go through. And I refer to things like the forward plan. When you discuss an item going in the forward plan, there should be a frank debate then about the proper method for taking that decision, whether it involves pre-decision scrutiny, whether it's a portfolio holder decision, the boundary line between officers and members, the level of transparency that can be afforded in taking that decision, considering commercial and other issues. Supporting that decision making process, I think you need to ensure that scrutiny is properly resourced. And I do appreciate that's a particularly challenging issue for a council that shares its officer resource with an adjoining council. But I would urge you to look at how you can resource that operation, and perhaps look at coordinating the activity with Havant to try and make the most effective use of the officer resource that you have. The monitoring officer is a particularly important role. It's a role which I know many councils undervalue. I can assure you, when you've been through some of the issues that I've been through in my career, I will never undervalue a monitoring officer. A monitoring officer doing their job effectively and well, it is absolutely essential in councils. And I think certainly whenever making an appointment as a monitoring officer, it's something that councils must think through very, very carefully. The final recommendation that I'd like to refer to, though, is recommendation 16. It's easy to look backwards. It's easy to be critical about the past. Very few of you were there when some of these things were going on, in rooms when some of these things may or may not have been happening. There's going to be no great merit in digging up the drains again. I've carried out a very detailed review. I've looked at literally hundreds, if not thousands, of emails. And what I've tried to do is, through that process, come forward with recommendations that help the council look forward. And I would urge the council to look forward. All councils face huge challenges. You face huge challenges with the recovery from COVID. You face huge challenges in terms of housing, finance, etc., etc. And I would urge the council to look forward rather than going back and reinvestigating yet again the sort of issues which I've not investigated, but I have reviewed. And I think it is important that the council looks at all of the recommendations I've made and considers them very carefully in the context of drawing a line under the past and moving forward.